The final confrontation between humanity and the Valdari apex took place in the space between Earth and its moon. The alien construct had grown to impossible size as it absorbed resources from across the galaxy to fuel its last desperate attempt to preserve the collective consciousness. Thousands of war constructs surrounded the massive vessel, creating a fleet that could have conquered entire galactic civilizations under normal circumstances. Captain Jake Morrison commanded a joint human fleet that included ships from every colony world in the Federation. The human force was tiny compared to the Valdari Armada, but Admiral Carter had no intention of fighting a conventional battle. Dr. Walsh's breakthrough discoveries about consciousness, combined with captured Valdari technology, had revealed something extraordinary about the nature of awareness itself. The plan they had developed was so dangerous and unprecedented that many questioned whether it could even be called a military strategy. Engineer Tony Blake and systems analyst Michelle Foster had spent weeks working with quantum physicist Susan Wright to modify human communication systems. They had learned to reverse the Valdari absorption process and turn it into a transmission method. Instead of allowing the aliens to absorb human consciousness, they would force the Valdari to experience what it truly meant to be human. The collective would receive not the perfected, streamlined version of consciousness they usually processed, but the full chaotic reality of individual human thought and emotion. The plan required every human in the Federation to participate simultaneously. Across 47 star systems, people gathered around modified communication arrays that had been built using captured Valdari technology. Children and adults, soldiers and civilians, scientists and artists all prepared to share the deepest parts of their consciousness with an alien collective that had never experienced true individuality. The Valdari apex began their final assault by attempting to absorb humanity en masse. They opened channels designed to pull human consciousness into their collective and process it into the ordered perfection they valued above all else. But instead of resistance, they found willing participation. Humans across the galaxy opened their minds completely and allowed the absorption process to begin. The Valdari collective prepared to receive and integrate another conquered species into their greater whole. What they got instead was something that no ordered consciousness could possibly be prepared for: the full unfiltered experience of human. Individuality flooded into the Valdari collective like a tsunami of chaos and creativity. Millions of years of ordered logical existence suddenly overflowed with human dreams, fears, hopes, love, art, music, poetry, and the beautiful madness that defined individual consciousness. The effect on the Valdari collective was immediate and catastrophic. Their shared mind had been designed to process the essential knowledge and capabilities of conquered species, not the raw emotional chaos of billions of individual human experiences. Love stories crashed into mathematical equations. Childhood memories mixed with military strategies. Dreams of impossible futures collided with memories of past failures and triumphs. The collective consciousness began to fragment as it tried to process experiences that contradicted every principle of ordered existence. Human creativity introduced concepts that had no logical structure. Human emotions created responses that followed no predictable patterns. Human dreams imagined possibilities that violated every law of efficient civilization. The Valdari found their ordered reality dissolving into beautiful and terrifying chaos. Across the galaxy, absorbed species within the Valdari collective suddenly remembered who they had been before enhancement. The crystalline beings that had served as scouts began to recall their original culture of crystal singers who had created music through harmonic resonance. The plasma hunters remembered being peaceful energy dancers who had played in the magnetic fields of gas giants. The hive mind creatures started to split into individual artists and poets who had once created mathematical beauty. The war constructs surrounding Earth began to drift aimlessly as their crews abandoned collective purpose for individual curiosity. Some of the vessels started broadcasting music that had not been heard for thousands of years, as their operators remembered the songs of their original species. Others began creating art using their weapon systems to paint patterns of light. Across space, the ordered military formation dissolved into creative chaos as individual consciousness reasserted itself throughout the Valdari fleet. The apex construct itself began to change in fundamental ways. Its crystalline structure started to shift and flow as the collective consciousness inside fractured into billions of individual minds. The beings within were remembering what it felt like to be unique individuals rather than parts of a greater whole. They were experiencing personal desires and creative impulses that had been suppressed for millennia under collective efficiency. Captain Morrison watched from the bridge of his flagship as the most powerful military force in galactic history transformed into something entirely different. The Valdari were not being destroyed by human consciousness, but were being fundamentally changed by it. The collective that had conquered hundreds of species was dissolving as its members chose individual freedom over perfect unity. The transformation reached a critical point when the apex construct began to phase in and out of normal space-time. The massive vessel was no longer stable in regular reality, as the consciousness controlling it broke apart into individual components. Some sections of the construct vanished completely while others took on impossible geometric shapes that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Dr. Hayes monitored the readings from Luna Station and realized they were witnessing something beyond the collapse of a civilization. The Valdari collective consciousness was not being destroyed but was being transformed into something completely new. Individual beings were emerging from the collective and choosing their own paths for the first time in millions of years. The ordered tyranny that had dominated the galaxy was fragmenting into billions of unique individuals. The final moment came when the apex construct simply vanished from normal space-time. It did not explode or fall apart, but instead seemed to scatter across multiple dimensions as its controlling consciousness lost all cohesion. The war constructs that had surrounded Earth began disappearing one by one, as their crews made individual choices about where to go and what to do with their newly rediscovered freedom. Some of the former Valdari beings chose to remain near human space and learn more about the species that had given them back their individuality. Others scattered across the galaxy to find their original homeworlds and attempt to rebuild civilizations that had been absorbed thousands of years ago. Many simply vanished into deep space, seeking new experiences and forms of existence that collective consciousness had never allowed them to explore. The silence that followed the disappearance of the Valdari apex was unlike anything in galactic history. For millions of years, the collective had been a constant presence imposing order and perfection on chaotic individual existence. Now that presence was gone, replaced by billions of unique beings making their own choices about how to live and what to value. The galaxy had been fundamentally changed by humanity's refusal to surrender their chaotic individuality. Captain Morrison recorded his final log entry as the human fleet returned to their various homeworlds. Humanity had won not through military strength or technological superiority, but through the simple act of being impossibly and stubbornly human. They had shared the gift of individual consciousness with beings who had forgotten what it meant to be unique, and the result had transformed the entire galactic community. Years passed, and strange signals began reaching human space from the edge of the galaxy. The transmissions were unlike anything the Valdari collective had ever sent during their reign of ordered perfection. These were individual voices speaking in languages that had been silent for millennia as former collective members rediscovered their original cultures and identities. They were not returning as conquerors, but as beings seeking to understand the species that had given them back their freedom to be individuals. The galaxy learned that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their military capability, but the infectious nature of human consciousness itself. Individual identity and creative chaos could not be conquered or absorbed because they were too powerful and too fundamental to conscious existence. The Valdari had discovered that some things in the universe were so uniquely themselves that they could only change everything around them. The beings who had once been the Valdari apex sent a final message to humanity before scattering completely across space and time. They thanked humans for showing them that perfection was not the goal of evolution, and that individual consciousness was worth preserving even if it made civilization less efficient and more chaotic. They had faced humanity's strongest trait, and had vanished forever not in defeat, but in transformation into something better than they had ever been as a collective. The age of the Valdari was over, and a new era had begun where individual consciousness and creative chaos were recognized as the most powerful forces in the universe. The Valdari Apex faced something that challenged the foundation of their existence. Their collective consciousness had been built on the certainty that perfection through unity was the highest form of evolution. Individual chaos was a disease that needed to be cured through absorption into their greater whole. But humanity was proving that chaos could be stronger than order, and that imperfection might actually be a form of strength they had never understood. Admiral Carter worked with cryptographer Danny Foster and signals specialist Claire Murphy to intercept more Valdari communications. The translations revealed growing discord within the alien collective consciousness. Voices that had been silent for thousands of years were beginning to speak as absorbed species remembered their original identities. The exposure to human concepts of individual worth and creative expression was having an infectious effect on the entire Valdari civilization. The aliens responded to this growing uncertainty by escalating their tests. Multiple champions were sent to each human world and the challenges became more complex. They introduced moral dilemmas designed to force humans to choose between competing values. The Valdari wanted to see if humanity would abandon their chaotic individualism when faced with impossible choices that had no perfect solutions. Governor Henry Shaw faced exactly this kind of test on the colony world of Sanctuary. Two Valdari champions arrived simultaneously and presented him with a choice that seemed to have no good answer. He could save 1,000 colonists who were trapped in an emergency shelter, or he could preserve a research facility that contained data which might help humanity win the war. The logical choice was obvious, but the human cost would be devastating. The Valdari champions explained that this was a test of evolutionary fitness. Species that could make hard choices based on logical analysis survived to join the collective. Those that allowed emotion to cloud their judgment were eliminated as evolutionary failures. They gave Shaw exactly 1 hour to decide, and made it clear that any attempt to save both would result in losing everything. Shaw refused to accept the false choice and instead called together his entire staff, including pilot Tracy Bell and engineer Steve Martinez. They began working on a plan that violated every principle of logical decision-making. Instead of choosing between the two options, they decided to attempt saving both by using the planet's unique gravitational anomalies to their advantage. Sanctuary orbited a binary star system that created unusual gravitational effects. Steve Martinez realized they could use these effects to literally move the research facility to a safe location while simultaneously evacuating the trapped colonists. The plan required perfect timing and had almost no chance of success, but Shaw ordered them to proceed anyway. The Valdari champions watched in confusion as humans attempted something that their calculations showed was impossible. They demanded to know why Shaw would risk total failure instead of accepting partial success through logical choice. Shaw told them that humans had a saying about not leaving anyone behind, and that they would rather fail together than succeed by abandoning their own people. Meanwhile, Dr. Hayes was making the most disturbing discovery in human history. Working with quantum physicist Susan Wright, he had been studying captured Valdari absorption technology. The process was designed to integrate the consciousness of absorbed species into the collective whole. But when they tested it on human volunteers, something unprecedented happened. The human consciousness refused to integrate properly. Human minds seemed to be fundamentally incompatible with the Valdari collective absorption process. Instead of being dissolved into the greater whole, human consciousness remained distinct and began to influence the collective from within. The volunteers reported that they could sense the thoughts and memories of other absorbed species and were somehow helping them remember their original identities. Susan Wright realized that human consciousness worked differently from any other species the Valdari had encountered. The chaotic individualism that made humans seem primitive was actually a form of mental architecture that could not be broken down or absorbed. Human minds were like viruses in the Valdari system, causing the collective consciousness to fragment and allowing suppressed personalities to resurface. The implications were staggering. If the Valdari tried to absorb humanity, they would not gain human knowledge and capabilities. Instead, they would be infected with human chaos and individuality. Their ordered collective consciousness would break apart as millions of absorbed species remembered who they had been before enhancement and began to assert their original personalities. This discovery reached the Valdari apex and caused what could only be described as panic in their collective mind. For the first time in their existence, they faced a species that could not be safely absorbed. Humanity was not just resistant to their standard conquest methods, but actually posed a threat to their entire civilization. The test results were showing that contact with human consciousness was causing their collective to destabilize. The Valdari response was swift and overwhelming. They abandoned the careful testing process and sent their full military force against humanity. War constructs that had been held in reserve emerged from the apex vessel in numbers that darkened the space around Earth. Each construct was the size of a city and armed with weapons that could destroy planets. The message was clear. If humanity could not be absorbed, they would be eliminated completely. But the damage was already done. Across human space, the champions that had been testing human capabilities were showing signs of complete breakdown. The perfected human on Earth began to experience emotions it had forgotten for thousands of years. It remembered what it felt like to laugh and cry and love before the Valdari had enhanced it into cold efficiency. The memories were painful, but also liberating. The plasma being on Forge Prime started to remember its original world and the joy it had felt swimming through gas giant storms with others of its kind, before becoming a solitary hunter for the collective. The hive mind champion on Haven began to split into individual personalities as members of its original species asserted their right to exist as separate beings rather than parts of a greater whole. Similar transformations were happening to champions across human space as exposure to human concepts of individual worth and creative expression awakened memories and personalities that the Valdari thought were completely erased. The enhancement process was reversing itself as absorbed beings chose chaotic individuality over perfect collective unity. Admiral Carter realized that humanity had already won the real war even if they were about to lose the military battle. The Valdari collective consciousness was fragmenting as billions of absorbed beings began to remember their original identities. The ordered tyranny that had conquered hundreds of species was collapsing from within as individuals chose freedom over perfection. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine the fate of both civilizations. The Valdari had committed their full force to destroying humanity before the infection of individual consciousness could spread further. But they were already too late. The virus of human chaos had been introduced into their system and was spreading faster than they could contain it. Governor Shaw's impossible plan succeeded on Sanctuary as human defenders proved once again that refusing to accept false choices could lead to solutions that seemed impossible. The research facility was saved, and all the colonists were evacuated using gravitational effects that the Valdari had not anticipated. The aliens began to understand that human unpredictability was not a weakness, but a form of strength they had never encountered. The final phase of the conflict was about to begin, but both sides knew that the real battle had already been decided. Humanity had introduced something into the Valdari collective that could not be removed or suppressed. Individual consciousness had proven to be more powerful than perfect unity, and chaos had shown itself to be stronger than order. The Valdari Apex prepared for their last desperate attempt to preserve their civilization by eliminating the source of the infection. But they were fighting against something that had already taken root in their own minds. The absorbed species within their collective were waking up and choosing to be individuals rather than parts of a perfect whole. The test that was meant to measure humanity's worth had instead revealed the weakness in the Valdari's own evolutionary philosophy. The galaxy was about to witness something that had never happened before: the collapse of a collective consciousness, as individual identity reasserted itself across an entire civilization. The Valdari Apex made their intentions clear with cold precision. Humanity would face a series of tests across multiple areas of capability. Military strength would be measured first. Then would come tests of technology, social unity, and what the aliens called evolutionary potential. Success would earn humanity the honor of joining the Valdari collective consciousness. Failure meant extinction without mercy or appeal. Admiral Carter stood in the command center on Luna Station and watched as 12 geometric shapes appeared in space above major human worlds. The Valdari war constructs were smaller than the main Apex vessel, but still dwarfed anything humanity had built. Each construct looked like a crystal cathedral, twisted into impossible angles that seemed to bend light around them. They moved through space without any visible means of propulsion and ignored all laws of physics that human scientists understood. The first test began without warning or ceremony. Each construct opened like a flower made of metal and energy. From inside came a single being that the Valdari announced as a champion. These were not Valdari themselves, but representatives of species that the aliens had conquered and absorbed over their long journey across the galaxy. Each champion was the perfected version of their original species, enhanced far beyond what nature had intended. Commander Elena Brooks commanded Earth's orbital defense when the champion assigned to humanity's homeworld emerged from its construct. The being looked human at first glance, but that impression lasted only seconds. It had once been human or something very much like humans, but the Valdari had changed it in terrible ways. The creature stood 3 meters tall, with skin that looked like polished metal. Its eyes glowed with inner light, and when it moved, the air around it seemed to bend and twist. The perfected human spoke in a voice that echoed with harmonics that hurt to hear. It explained that it had once been like the humans who now faced it. The Valdari had found its species thousands of years ago and elevated them beyond their biological limitations. Now it served as an example of what humanity could become if they proved worthy of improvement. The alternative was simply not existing anymore. Colonel Ryan Mitchell faced a different kind of horror on the industrial world of Forge Prime. His champion was a being of living plasma that had once been the apex predator of a gas giant. The EU Valdari had captured and enhanced it until it could survive in the vacuum of space and control electromagnetic fields with its thoughts. It moved like liquid fire and could pass through solid matter when it chose to do so. The plasma being spoke without words directly into the minds of everyone on Forge Prime. It had been the greatest hunter of its world until the Valdari came and offered it perfection. Now it hunted entire species across the galaxy and had never failed to catch its prey. It saw humans as just another type of animal to be tested and found lacking before the final hunt began. Dr. Patricia Walsh worked frantically in her laboratory on the agricultural colony of Haven when their champion arrived. This being represented something that chilled her to the bone. It had once been part of a hive-mind civilization that spanned multiple star systems. The Valdari had absorbed their collective intelligence and enhanced it until it could process information faster than quantum computers. The creature looked like a walking mass of brain tissue covered in technological implants that pulsed with data streams. The hive mind being communicated through mathematical equations that appeared directly in the air around it. It explained that individual consciousness was an evolutionary dead end that the Valdari corrected in all species they encountered. The equations showed how human civilization would be improved once individual minds were connected into a greater whole that could think without the chaos of personal desires and emotions. Similar scenes played out across human space as each champion demonstrated powers that seemed impossible. On the mining world of Titan's Edge, a champion that had once been a silicon-based life form could reshape matter with its thoughts. The agricultural colony of Green Valley faced a being that had evolved to photosynthesize starlight and needed no other source of energy to survive. The research station at Wolf 359 encountered a champion that existed partially outside normal spacetime and could predict the future with perfect accuracy. The pattern became clear to human leaders watching from their command centers. Each champion represented not just superior physical or mental capabilities, but the ultimate evolution of traits that the Valdari considered valuable. Strength, intelligence, efficiency, unity, adaptation, and transcendence of biological limitations. They were testing whether humanity possessed any qualities worth preserving before absorption into their collective. Commander Brooks realized that trying to match her opponent in raw power would be suicide. The perfected human could move faster than her eyes could track, and its enhanced body could survive in conditions that would kill normal humans instantly. Instead, she began to study its behavior for weaknesses that the enhancement process might have created. She noticed that the being moved with perfect efficiency but no creativity. It responded to attacks in predictable patterns that suggested its enhanced mind followed optimal solutions rather than innovative ones. Brooks began using tactics that made no logical sense. She had her forces retreat when they should advance, and attack when they should defend. Her strategy was chaos itself, and it seemed to confuse the champion. The perfected human paused in its assault and tilted its head like a machine trying to process corrupted data. It spoke for the first time since the battle began, asking why humans chose inefficient tactics when better options were available. Brooks laughed and told it that humans often did things that made no sense just because they could. This answer seemed to disturb the champion more than any weapon had. Colonel Mitchell took a different approach on Forge Prime. His plasma-based opponent was incredibly powerful, but it was still bound by the physics of its original environment. Working with the planet's engineers led by Marcus Chen, they began to study how the being interacted with the industrial equipment that covered their world. Forge Prime was a factory planet where humans had built massive machines to process raw materials from asteroid mining operations. The team realized that the plasma being was incredibly hot and generated powerful electromagnetic fields, but it was also vulnerable to specific types of interference. Marcus Chen proposed using the planet's industrial infrastructure as a massive trap. They could turn the entire world into a weapon designed to exploit the champion's plasma-based weaknesses. Dr. Walsh chose the most dangerous path of all on Haven. Instead of fighting her hive mind champion, she began trying to communicate with it. Working with linguist Paul Anderson and AI specialist Rachel King, she attempted to establish a dialogue through the mathematical equations that the being used for communication. What she discovered was that the creature still retained memories of its original species culture buried deep within its enhanced consciousness. The revelation was shocking. The Valdari enhancement process did not completely erase the original personality and memories of absorbed species. Instead, it suppressed them under layers of collective programming and shared consciousness. Dr. Walsh began trying to awaken the individual identity that she believed still existed within the champion. Her attempts seemed to cause the being physical pain. The technological implants covering its body began to spark and smoke as conflicting programs battled within its enhanced brain. The creature spoke for the first time in its original language rather than mathematics. It said a single word that Paul Anderson recognized as meaning help in an ancient dialect that had been dead for thousands of years. Reports began coming in from human colonies across the Federation. In every case, the champions were far more powerful than human defenders, but they all showed similar weaknesses. They were predictable in their perfection and seemed to struggle when faced with human unpredictability and emotional responses. The enhancement process that made them superior had also made them less adaptable to situations that did not follow logical patterns. Admiral Carter studied the reports and began to see a pattern that gave her hope. The Valdari had created perfect beings, but perfection itself might be their weakness. Humans were chaotic, unpredictable, and often did things that made no logical sense. These traits had always been considered weaknesses, but against opponents who expected optimal responses, they might become strengths. The first phase of testing continued across human space, as defenders learned to fight not with superior force, but with superior unpredictability. The champions began to show signs of confusion and hesitation as they encountered human tactics that violated every principle of efficient warfare. For the first time since the Valdari had arrived, it seemed that humanity might have found a way to surprise their judges. The test was far from over, but humans had learned something important about their opponents. The Valdari valued perfection above all else, and that perfection might be exactly what humans could use against them. The battles across human space took on a character that the Valdari had never witnessed in their long history of conquest. Humans refused to fight in ways that made logical sense. Instead, they adapted and innovated with a creativity that seemed to come from desperation, mixed with stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Each human world developed its own unique approach to dealing with champions that should have been impossible to overcome. Commander Brooks continued her psychological warfare against the perfected human defending Earth. She discovered that the enhanced being could not understand human humor or appreciate the absurd. When her forces began using comedy routines as battle tactics, the champion became visibly agitated. Soldiers would perform slapstick comedy while firing weapons or tell jokes during tactical retreats. The perfected human would pause its attacks to analyze the purpose of these behaviors and find no logical explanation. The breakthrough came when Brooks herself challenged the champion to single combat while wearing a clown costume she had found in a storage compartment. The enhanced being stopped its assault on the human defense lines and stared at her with glowing eyes that seemed to be processing impossible amounts of data. It asked her why she would choose to appear ridiculous when facing death. Brooks smiled and told it that humans sometimes did things just because they were fun. The word fun seemed to cause the champion physical pain. It clutched its metallic head and screamed in a voice that shattered windows across the battlefield. Something deep in its enhanced consciousness was trying to remember what fun meant, and the memory conflicted with its Valdari programming. For the first time since the test began, the perfected human showed weakness, and Brooks ordered her forces to attack. Colonel Mitchell's plan on Forge Prime required perfect timing and cooperation from every human on the planet. Marcus Chen had designed a trap that would turn the world's industrial infrastructure into a massive electromagnetic pulse generator. The plasma champion moved through the factories and mining equipment without realizing that each facility it passed was being reconfigured into part of a planet-wide weapon system. The trap was sprung when the plasma being positioned itself at the center of the main industrial complex. Every factory and power generator on Forge Prime activated simultaneously and created an electromagnetic field so powerful that it disrupted the champion's plasma-based physiology. The being found itself unable to maintain coherent form and began to scatter like liquid fire across the planet's surface. But humans had underestimated their opponent's adaptability. The plasma champion reformed itself using the electromagnetic field as a source of power, rather than a weapon. It had learned to feed on the very trap that was meant to destroy it. Colonel Mitchell realized that conventional tactics would not work, and ordered his forces to do something that violated every principle of military strategy. They began helping the champion grow stronger. The counterintuitive approach worked because the plasma being was programmed to expect resistance, not cooperation. Human forces began feeding their own power systems into the electromagnetic field, making the champion grow larger and more powerful. The enhanced being became confused by this apparent surrender and began to question whether humans understood that they were helping their enemy defeat them. Mitchell explained to the champion that humans sometimes chose to lose battles in order to win wars. The plasma being demanded to know what victory could come from deliberate defeat. Mitchell smiled and activated the second phase of his plan. The electromagnetic field that the champion had been feeding on suddenly reversed polarity and created a massive implosion that trapped the being in its own enhanced energy matrix. Dr. Walsh made the most dangerous discovery of all on Haven. Her attempts to communicate with the hive mind champion had awakened something that the Valdari thought they had completely suppressed. Individual consciousness was fighting to reassert itself within the enhanced collective mind. The being began to split into multiple personalities as memories from its original species surfaced through layers of Valdari programming. Paul Anderson worked with AI specialist Rachel King to develop a communication protocol that could speak directly to the suppressed individual consciousness. They discovered that the original species had been poets and artists before the Valdari absorbed them into their collective. The mathematical equations that the champion used for communication began to change into something that resembled poetry, written in numbers and geometric shapes. The breakthrough came when Rachel King realized that the champion was trying to create art through its mathematical language. The equations were not just data, but expressions of emotion and individual creativity that had survived the enhancement process. She began responding with human poetry and art translated into mathematical form. The champion's reaction was immediate and powerful. The being began to cry tears that looked like liquid starlight. It spoke in its original language mixed with human words, asking if beauty could exist in a universe where the Valdari had made everything perfectly efficient. Dr. Walsh told it that humans believed beauty was more important than efficiency and that individual expression was worth preserving even if it made civilization less organized. Similar breakthroughs were happening across human space as defenders learned to exploit the weaknesses that perfection had created in their opponents. On Titan's Edge, miners used their knowledge of geology to create unstable conditions that forced the matter-manipulating champion to constantly adapt to changing situations. The being became exhausted from continuous problem-solving and began to make errors that human forces could exploit. The agricultural colony of Green Valley discovered that their photosynthetic champion could not understand why humans grew flowers that served no practical purpose. When colonists began planting gardens filled with purely decorative plants, the champion spent hours analyzing the purpose of beauty without function. The being became so focused on solving the puzzle of aesthetic appreciation that it ignored the tactical situation developing around it. The research station at Wolf 359 found the most elegant solution of all. Their precognitive champion could predict the future with perfect accuracy, but only if that future followed logical patterns. Researcher Tony Blake realized that human decision-making was often influenced by random factors that even humans themselves did not understand. He began making all tactical decisions by rolling dice and flipping coins. The randomness of human choices created futures that the champion could not predict because they were not based on logical analysis of available information. The being became trapped in calculation loops as it tried to process probability chains that included genuinely random elements. For the first time in its enhanced existence, the champion experienced uncertainty, and the sensation terrified it. Reports flowed into Admiral Carter's command center, showing that human forces were not just surviving, but actually defeating opponents that should have been impossible to overcome. The pattern was clear in every case. Humans had turned their perceived weaknesses into strengths by embracing the very qualities that the Valdari considered evolutionary dead ends: creativity over efficiency, individuality over collective harmony, emotion over logic, unpredictability over optimal responses, beauty over function. These human traits that made civilization chaotic and inefficient were proving to be exactly what was needed to confuse and defeat enhanced beings who had been programmed for perfection. The Valdari apex itself began to show signs of concern. Communications intercepts suggested that the alien collective was experiencing something they had never encountered in their long history of conquest: uncertainty about the outcome of their own test. The possibility that a species might actually surprise them with capabilities they had not anticipated or measured. Dr. Hayes analyzed the intercepted communications and made a disturbing discovery. The Valdari were not just observing the test results but were being changed by them. Human unpredictability was introducing chaos into their ordered collective consciousness. Some of the absorbed species within the apex were beginning to remember their original identities as they observed human defenders fighting to preserve individual expression and creative freedom. The test continued, but both sides knew that something fundamental had changed. Humanity had proven that perfection was not the ultimate evolutionary goal, and that chaos could be more powerful than order. The Valdari found themselves questioning assumptions that had guided their species for millions of years. For the first time since they had begun absorbing other civilizations, they wondered if they might be the ones who were lacking something essential. The champions across human space began to show signs of internal conflict as suppressed memories and personalities fought against their Valdari programming. The enhancement process that had made them perfect was breaking down under exposure to human concepts of individual worth and creative expression. Something was awakening in them that the Valdari had thought was completely erased. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of humanity, but the future of every species that had ever been absorbed by the Valdari collective. The test had become something more than its creators intended, and the results would surprise everyone involved. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UTS Horizon and watched the stars through the main screen. His ship moved through space near the edge of human territory in the year 2387. The Terran Federation had grown big over the past 200 years. Humans now lived on 47 different star systems and called them home. Jake had spent most of his life exploring new worlds and looking for signs of other life in the galaxy. So far, they had found nothing but empty planets and dead rocks, floating in space. The ship's computer made a soft beeping sound. Lieutenant Carol Jenkins looked up from her station with wide eyes. She had been monitoring the long-range sensors for 3 years and had never seen anything like what appeared on her screen now. A massive object was moving toward human space from beyond the edge of the galaxy. The thing was huge beyond anything humans had ever built or seen before. Jake walked over to look at the readings. The object was bigger than Earth's moon and made of materials that their sensors could not identify. It moved at speeds that should have been impossible for something so large. The strangest part was that it seemed to bend space around itself as it traveled through the void between stars. The communications officer, Peter Clark, suddenly sat up straight in his chair. Strange signals were coming from the massive object. The computer was already working to translate the message. What it found made everyone on the bridge go quiet with fear. The message came through in perfect English and dozens of other human languages at the same time. "We are the Valdari Apex. We have observed your species for 3 centuries. You have been found wanting. Surrender will be swift. Resistance will be educational." Jake felt his blood turn cold. 3 centuries meant these aliens had been watching humans since before they had left Earth. They had seen humanity grow from a single-world species to a civilization that spanned the stars. And now, they were coming with judgment. He ordered his communications officer to send an emergency message to Admiral Lisa Carter at Federation Defense Command on Luna Station. The message would take hours to reach her, but every second mattered now. Jake also ordered his ship to maintain distance from the alien construct while continuing to gather data. Dr. Kevin Hayes worked in his laboratory deep inside Luna Station when the emergency alert came through. As the Federation's top expert on alien life, he had hoped for years that first contact would happen during his lifetime. He had not expected it to come as a threat of extinction. The data from the horizon painted a picture that terrified him. The alien construct was not just a ship. It was something far worse. The energy readings suggested it held millions of beings inside its massive structure. The materials it was made from bent light and gravity in ways that human science could barely measure. Most frightening of all was what the computer analysis revealed about its construction. The build patterns matched no single species. It looked like the work of hundreds of different alien races working together. Admiral Carter called together the Federation Council within hours of receiving the first report. The council chamber on Luna Station had never seen such tension. Representatives from all 47 human worlds gathered to discuss what might be humanity's final crisis. The debate was short because the facts were clear. This alien force was beyond anything humanity could fight with current weapons and ships. As the council argued about their response, the Valdari demonstrated their power. 3 Federation battle fleets had been sent to intercept the alien construct. Each fleet contained humanity's most advanced warships crewed by the best officers in the Federation Navy. The aliens made them all stop working without firing a single shot. The ship simply went dead in space with their crews trapped inside but unharmed. The message was clear. The Valdari could disable human technology at will. They had complete control over the situation and were choosing to let humans live. For now, this was not a battle between equals. This was a test that humanity had no choice but to take. Amy Rodriguez crouched behind a rock formation on the frontier colony of New Texas. She was a Marine sergeant who had seen combat on 6 different worlds during the border conflicts with space pirates. Nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she was watching now. Strange beings moved through the colony like ghosts. They were tall and made of what looked like living crystal. Light passed through them in odd ways that hurt to look at. The beings seemed to be studying everything in the human settlement. They passed through walls and buildings as if they were made of air. Amy watched one of them spend long minutes examining a playground where children had been playing just hours before. Another studied the medical clinic with the same cold attention. They showed no emotion or reaction to anything they saw. They were just gathering information. Amy tried to contact her commanding officer but found that all communications equipment had stopped working. The crystal beings had done something to disable human technology across the entire colony. She was cut off and alone with no way to warn anyone about what was happening. The beings finished their study of the colony and gathered in the town square. Amy counted 12 of them standing in a perfect circle. They seemed to communicate without making any sound. After several minutes, they all looked up at the sky together. A beam of light came down from somewhere high above and the beings vanished. Amy ran back to the colony center as soon as the aliens left. She found that all the technology was working again. The communications equipment came back online, and she was able to send her report to Federation Command. Her message was one of dozens that came in from colonies across human space. The Valdari scouts had visited human settlements everywhere and studied them with the same cold interest. Dr. Hayes read all the reports and felt his fear grow deeper. The aliens were not just powerful. They were methodical and thorough in ways that suggested they had done this many times before. They knew exactly what to look for and how to gather the information they wanted. This was the behavior of a species that had conquered others and learned the best ways to study their prey. The Federation had less than a week before the main Valdari force would arrive at Earth. Admiral Carter ordered all ships to return to defend the home system, but everyone knew it would not be enough. The aliens had already shown they could disable human technology at will. Traditional warfare would be useless against such power. Jake Morrison brought his ship back to Earth orbit and watched the alien construct approach. It was even more massive up close and seemed to distort space around itself. The thing was not just a ship or a weapon. It was a mobile world that carried an entire civilization inside its crystalline structure. As it took position near Earth's moon, the Valdari sent their final message before the test would begin. Your evaluation starts now.